The air inside the courtroom was heavy, suffocating. Every seat was filled, every eye locked onto Detective Madison Hayes as she stepped up to the witness stand. The sharp click of her heels against the polished floor echoed in the hushed space. She had been here before, dozens of times over the past 12 years, but today felt different. Today she wasn't just another officer giving testimony. Today her words could determine the fate of Jamal Carter, the activist seated stiffly at the defense table, accused of assaulting an officer during a protest in downtown Atlanta. At the prosecution's table, District Attorney Robert Kane stood with a commanding presence, buttoning his suit jacket as he approached the witness stand. He exuded confidence, the kind that came with years of securing convictions. Detective Hayes, Kane began smoothly, "Can you confirm for the court whether you personally witnessed the defendant, Jamal Carter, initiate physical contact with Officer Ethan Wallace on the night of August 14th? The question was straightforward, so was the answer. "Yes," Madison replied, her voice steady. "I saw him throw the first punch." The impact of her words rippled through the room like a gunshot. A murmur swept through the spectators, reporters' pens scratched against notepads, and a tense energy filled the space. Jamal sat motionless, jaw clenched, his fingers curled against the table's edge. Beside him, his attorney, Stephen Caldwell, remained perfectly still, expression unreadable. But something in his gaze sent a shiver down Madison's spine. Kane continued, pressing his advantage. "To be clear, you're stating under oath that you saw Mr. Carter act aggressively first." "Yes," Madison squared her shoulders. "He turned toward Officer Wallace, raised his fist, and struck him in the face. That's when Officer Wallace and I intervened to subdue him." The room felt smaller now, more enclosed. Even the judge leaned forward slightly, observing her closely. Kane nodded approvingly and took a step back. "No further questions, Your Honor." The judge shifted his gaze. "Mr. Caldwell, your witness." Stephen Caldwell stood with deliberate ease, his navy mule suit crisp, every movement measured. He was an older man, seasoned and unshakable, a defense attorney who had built his career dismantling cases just like this one. He approached the stand slowly, letting the silence settle, stretching the moment until the air itself seemed to tighten. Then he smiled, not a friendly smile, but the kind that made Madison's stomach knot. "Detective Hayes," he said, voice calm but razor sharp, "how long have you been with the department?" 12 years, she answered. Caldwell nodded. "And in that time you've testified in court before?" "Many times." His smile didn't waver, but his eyes gleamed with something dangerous. "So you understand the importance of accuracy and testimony?" Madison's hands tightened on the wooden ledge in front of her. "Of course." Caldwell exhaled, shaking his head slightly, almost as if he pitied her. "That's good to hear," he murmured, "because what I'm about to show you will require absolute accuracy." At the defense table, his assistant was already setting up a screen. The courtroom was about to witness the truth, and Madison had no idea what was coming. A hush fell over the courtroom as Stephen Caldwell turned toward the defense table. His assistant worked quickly, setting up the screen, the soft clicks of the keyboard the only sound breaking the tense silence. Detective Madison Hayes felt her pulse quicken. The weight of Caldwell's words still lingered in the air. "What I'm about to show you will require absolute accuracy." She forced herself to keep her posture straight, fingers gripping the wooden ledge of the witness stand. She had testified countless times before, handled aggressive defense attorneys, seen all their tactics. But something about Caldwell's confidence unsettled her. The lights dimmed, the screen flickered. The timestamp in the corner read August 14th, 10:47 p.m., the night of the incident. At first, the footage was chaotic, flashing red and blue lights, people moving, the sound of officers barking orders mixed with protesters shouting back. But then the camera steadied, and the picture became clear. Jamal Carter stood in the middle of the street, his hands raised, palms open, defensive, non-threatening. His mouth moved, clearly speaking, but there was no aggression in his stance. Madison's stomach tightened. On the screen, Officer Ethan Wallace stepped toward Jamal, pointing a finger at his chest. Jamal took a small step back. Wallace moved closer, shoving him. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Madison's breath caught. Wallace shoved him again, harder this time. Jamal stumbled, his foot catching on the curb, and before he could regain his balance, another officer grabbed him, yanking him to the ground. The courtroom fell completely silent. Then came the moment that sealed everything. Not once in the footage did Jamal throw a punch. The screen went black. For a second, no one moved. No one spoke. The weight of what they had just witnessed pressed down on the room like an anvil. Then, from the back of the courtroom, a single voice cut through the silence. "She lied." Gasps erupted. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." Madison's throat went dry. She could feel eyes drilling into her, judging, accusing. The once neutral expressions in the room had turned to something darker, something sharper. Caldwell let the reaction linger before turning back to Madison. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were piercing. "Detective Hayes," he said, voice calm but firm, "would you like to revise your testimony?" She swallowed, her hands tightening into fists on the stand. Before she could answer, Robert Kane shot to his feet. "Objection!" "Overruled." The judge's voice was sharp, leaving no room for argument. Caldwell stepped closer. "Detective," he pressed, lowering his voice, "you testified under oath that you saw Jamal Carter attack Officer Wallace." He gestured toward the screen. "We all just watched the moment you swore happen." His tone was razor-sharp now, cutting straight through her defenses. "And it didn't." Madison's heart pounded so loudly it drowned out everything else. And outside the courthouse, the world was already watching. The courtroom had descended into chaos. The judge's gavel slammed against the wood, demanding order. But the energy in the room had already shifted beyond control. People whispered, muttered, some openly scowled at Detective Madison Hayes as she sat frozen in the witness stand. She had faced tough moments in court before, but this was different. This wasn't skepticism, this was fury. Robert Kane, the prosecutor, sat rigid in his chair, jaw tight, flipping through his notes as if trying to find a way to salvage what had just happened. Stephen Caldwell, meanwhile, remained perfectly composed, adjusting his suit jacket like he had been expecting this all along. But it was Jamal Carter's expression that cut the deepest. He didn't smirk, he didn't gloat. He just stared at her, his face unreadable, his jaw set tight. The judge sighed, rubbing his temples. "We will reconvene after a recess. Court is adjourned." The second the gavel struck, reporters bolted for the exits, phones already in hand, eager to break the story that had just unfolded. Madison barely heard them. Her vision narrowed, heart hammering as she pushed herself to her feet and walked toward the exit, eyes avoiding the crowd. As soon as she stepped into the hallway, flashes of cameras blinded her. "Detective Hayes, do you have a statement? Did you knowingly lie under oath? Are you facing perjury charges?" Madison clenched her jaw and pushed forward. No comment. She made it outside, but the city had already seen the footage. The world had seen it. Her phone vibrated relentlessly in her pocket. Messages from unknown numbers, missed calls from Captain William Monroe. By the time she reached her car, she could barely steady her hands enough to unlock the door. She sat in the driver's seat, exhaling shakily. Another call. "Monroe." She hesitated, then answered. "Sir." "Not over the phone," he cut her off. His voice was flat, unreadable. "Inside. Now." The line went dead. Madison stared at her own reflection in the rearview mirror, the distant glow of flashing news cameras behind her. She had walked into court as a respected officer. Now, Now she was the face of everything people already believed about cops who twisted the truth to protect their own. She gritted her teeth, forcing herself to breathe. She had to get ahead of this. But deep down, she knew there was no getting ahead of it. The precinct was colder than usual. Or maybe it was just Detective Madison Hayes who felt it that way. Every step she took down the hallway felt heavier, the whispers louder. Officers she had worked with for years either avoided eye contact or watched her with thinly veiled scrutiny. She was no longer one of them. By the time she reached Captain William Monroe's office, her pulse was a dull roar in her ears. She pushed open the door without knocking. Monroe sat behind his desk, arms crossed, face unreadable. Lieutenant Daniel Briggs, a senior officer in internal affairs, stood near the window, his gaze colder than the room itself. "Close the door," Monroe said. Madison did. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, before Monroe finally spoke. "What the hell happened in that courtroom?" Madison exhaled, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. "I testified based on what I believed I saw." "What you believed?" Monroe cut in, voice sharp. "You swore under oath that you saw Carter throw a punch, then a damn video played, and guess what? No punch." Madison's throat tightened. "I didn't lie. You got caught," Briggs interrupted flatly. "And now the entire city is on fire." Monroe leaned forward. "The mayor's office is breathing down our necks. Internal Affairs is opening a formal investigation. Protesters are already outside demanding action." Madison's stomach twisted. She had seen protests before, had worked crowd control, had held the line. Now she was the reason people were in the streets. Monroe sighed, rubbing his temple. "For now, we're putting you on administrative leave, effective immediately." A sharp chill ran through her. "You're suspending me?" "It's not a suspension," Briggs corrected. "It's damage control." Madison clenched her jaw. "So, that's it? I followed the case the way you all wanted, and now I'm the scapegoat?" Monroe's stare hardened. "You made the call in that courtroom, Madison, and now we're all paying for it." She shook her head, her fists curling. "You knew what this case was. You all did. But now that the heat's on, I'm just expendable?" Briggs let out a sharp breath. "Welcome to reality." The words stung more than she wanted to admit. Monroe stood. "Turn in your badge and gun before you leave. Don't talk to the press. Don't make this worse than it already is." Madison's fingers twitched toward her badge, the symbol she had built her career on. The weight of it suddenly felt unbearable. But what choice did she have? With stiff fingers, she unclipped it from her belt, placed it on the desk, then laid her service weapon beside it. When she turned to leave, neither Monroe nor Briggs said another word. Because she wasn't one of them anymore. The city was on edge. By nightfall, thousands had gathered outside the Atlanta Police Department headquarters, their voices rising in a deafening chorus of anger and frustration. Signs demanding justice for Jamal Carter waved above the crowd, illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights of squad cars lined up to control the unrest. For Detective Madison Hayes, the protest was no longer just something happening outside. It was personal. From her apartment window, she could see the reflection of the flames. Someone had set a trash bin on fire near the station. The news played in the background, anchors dissecting the footage of her testimony, the video that exposed her, and the department's decision to place her on leave. She knew how this worked. The department was hoping the storm would pass, but it wouldn't. Not this time. Meanwhile, across the city, Jamal Carter sat at a conference table, surrounded by reporters. His lawyer, Stephen Caldwell, stood beside him, a pillar of calm as cameras flashed. Jamal leaned into the microphone. His voice was steady. "They tried to bury me with a lie," he said, pausing just long enough for the weight of his words to sink in. "If there hadn't been a video, we all know how this would have ended." A murmur rippled through the press. "This isn't just about me," he continued. his gaze scanning the room. How many people have sat in courtrooms like mine? How many officers have taken the stand and told stories that weren't true? He let the silence stretch before delivering his final blow. How many times did the system work exactly the way it was designed? The crowd erupted in applause. Outside, protesters watching the live stream cheered, their chants growing louder. But the department wasn't just sitting back. Inside the Atlanta PD headquarters, Captain William Monroe and a group of high-ranking officers huddled in the conference room. The tension was suffocating. "The protests aren't dying down," one officer muttered. "We need a response." "We should have never let Hayes testify," another said bitterly. "She was our best shot at conviction," someone countered. "She just got caught." Monroe's face was stone. He looked around the room, his voice dropping to a near growl. "We have two options. We throw Hayes under the bus and the public might back off. Or we protect her, and the department takes the hit." Silence. Then one officer spoke the words that sealed Madison's fate. "She's expendable." The courtroom was packed again, but this time Detective Madison Hayes wasn't standing at the witness stand. She was at the defense table. The weight of the moment pressed down on her as she sat beside her attorney, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Cameras lined the back of the courtroom, reporters whispering among themselves, waiting to see how far the system was willing to go to punish one of its own. Across the room, Prosecutor Angela Warren adjusted her glasses before stepping forward, her expression unreadable. "Your Honor," she began, voice even. "The facts in this case are simple. Detective Hayes took the stand, swore under oath, and provided false testimony that could have resulted in the wrongful conviction of Jamal Carter. If not for the video evidence, an innocent man would have faced years in prison." Madison kept her gaze forward. "Perjury is not a minor offense," Warren continued, her tone sharpening, "especially when committed by a law enforcement officer, someone who has taken an oath to uphold justice. This was not a mistake. This was a deliberate decision." Her lawyer, Nathan Green, finally rose from his seat. "My client has no prior record. She has served the community for over a decade. We are asking for leniency." Warren's eyes narrowed. "Leniency? Would Jamal Carter have been given leniency if that video hadn't existed?" Green exhaled but said nothing. The judge cleared his throat. "Detective Hayes, rise." Madison stood, her heart pounding. "After reviewing the facts of this case, this court finds you guilty of perjury." A murmur spread through the room, but the judge didn't pause. "Given your lack of prior criminal history and years of service, this court is sentencing you to 5 years of probation, the immediate revocation of your law enforcement certification, and 200 hours of community service." Someone in the crowd scoffed. "No jail time." From the front row, Jamal Carter didn't look surprised. His expression didn't change as he watched the system do exactly what it was designed to do. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. "Detective Hayes, do you have any regrets? Do you think your punishment was fair? Will you apologize to Jamal Carter?" For the first time since the trial began, Madison stopped. She turned, meeting the cameras head-on. "I was wrong," she said, voice steady. "I should have told the truth." Silence. But one officer telling the truth too late isn't justice. She took a breath. "The system let me lie. The system let me walk." And for the first time, she truly understood what that meant. The storm wasn't over. Days after the trial, the protests only grew louder. Jamal Carter was no longer just a man who had been wrongfully accused. He had become a symbol. His face was on posters. His words were chanted in the streets. Justice wasn't just about his exoneration anymore. It was about change. And for Madison Hayes, there was no returning to her old life. She wasn't in prison, but she wasn't free either. She was a cop who had been caught lying. Her badge was gone, her reputation destroyed. Everywhere she went, she felt the weight of the stares, some filled with contempt, others with quiet curiosity, wondering if she was yet another officer who would disappear into obscurity. She didn't intend to. One evening, as the sun set over the city, she stood outside a community center, watching through the window as Jamal spoke to a packed room. The energy inside was electric, people of all ages and backgrounds listening intently, nodding as he laid out his plans for police reform, for accountability beyond just his case. She hesitated before walking in. The moment she stepped inside, all eyes turned to her. Conversations hushed. People shifted uncomfortably, some crossing their arms. She was the enemy. Jamal's gaze met hers, unreadable. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he gave a small nod toward an empty chair. An invitation. She took it. The discussion continued, and for the first time, Madison listened. Really listened. She didn't try to justify herself. She didn't try to defend her past actions. She sat there, absorbing the anger, the pain, the stories of people who had been on the receiving end of the system she had once sworn to uphold. By the time the meeting ended, people still looked at her with skepticism, but she was there. As the crowd dispersed, Jamal walked over. He studied her for a moment before speaking. "You looking for redemption?" Madison exhaled. "I don't know if I deserve it." Jamal nodded slowly. "Good. Then maybe you're finally starting to get it." She had spent over a decade thinking she understood justice. That night she realized she had only ever seen one side of it. Outside, the city was still burning with the fire of change. The fight wasn't over. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't standing on the other side of it. The fall of Madison Hayes is more than just a story about a single police officer caught in a lie. It's a reflection of a deeply flawed system that has allowed injustice to thrive for far too long. Truth versus power. This case shows how power can manipulate narratives, but when the truth is undeniable, even those protected by the system can fall. Without that video, Jamal Carter would have been just another statistic, another man convicted because the system favored authority over evidence. Accountability versus protection. Madison Hayes wasn't the first officer to give false testimony, but she was one of the few who got caught. Instead of protecting her, the system turned its back on her to save itself. Loyalty only exists in the system when it's convenient. Justice versus redemption. Even after being exposed, Madison didn't face real consequences. No jail time, no criminal record, just probation and community service. Compare that to how many innocent people have lost years of their lives over false charges. But the real lesson? Acknowledging the truth is just the first step. What you do next defines who you are. So what happens now? The fight isn't over. The system doesn't change because of one case. It changes when enough people demand it. Justice should never depend on whether or not there's a camera recording. What do you think? Do you believe Madison's punishment was fair? Should more officers be held accountable for false testimony? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, don't stop here. Like this video if you believe in real justice. Share this story to keep the conversation going. Subscribe for more hard-hitting stories that expose the truth. Because justice isn't just a word, it's a fight, and it starts with you.